At my husband's funeral, a stranger walked out of the cemetery fog to tell me I had buried the wrong man. The problem wasn't the casket. It was the decade-old, legally binding secret he'd taken to the grave. The rain was a relentless gray curtain, matching the mood of the entire cemetery. It slicked the polished granite of David's headstone, making the engraved dates look like they were weeping. I clutched the damp umbrella, the cheap plastic handle digging into my palm, and tried to focus on the eulogy my sister was delivering. But the words were just a muffled drone beneath the sound of the storm. David was gone. Cancer had taken him with a brutal efficiency that felt deeply unfair for a man who still had so much life left in him. Or so I kept telling myself. I was 29. We'd been married for 7 years. Our life together felt like a perfectly constructed set piece. The mortgage on the Craftsman house, the rescue dog snoring by the fireplace, the plans for a small vineyard we were going to plant next spring. All of it was now a hollow shell, echoing with his absence. After the final prayer, as the gravediggers prepared to lower the mahogany casket, a box far too opulent for the practical man David had been, people started drifting away, murmuring condolences. I needed a minute. I needed the earth to stop spinning, just for a moment, so I could breathe without feeling the crushing weight of finality. My best friend Sarah gently guided me toward the waiting black car. "Come on, Alara, we need to get you inside. You look like you're about to float away." I nodded weakly, pulling my black veil tighter against the wind. That's when I saw her. She hadn't been standing with the main group near the tent. She materialized from behind a cluster of ancient yews, standing unnervingly close to the freshly dug grave. She was tall, dressed in a severe, tailored suit that looked expensive but strangely out of place for a muddy cemetery service. Her face was hidden mostly by a wide-brimmed hat, but the way she stood, rigid, watching me, drew my eye like a magnetic pull. She didn't look grieving. She looked assessing. I watched her for a moment too long. Sarah followed my gaze, frowning. "Who is that? I don't recognize her. She didn't come with David's business contacts, did she?" David had been an architect, a partner in a mid-sized firm. His professional network was extensive, but this woman had the bearing of someone who didn't rely on networking events. She had an aura of cold, established certainty. Before I could process anything, she moved. She walked toward me with a measured, deliberate pace that seemed utterly unconcerned with the mud clinging to her designer heels. The few remaining mourners paused, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The air around us went from somber to tense in an instant. She stopped directly in front of me, just outside the small circle of my immediate family. The rain seemed to lessen its intensity, as if even the weather was holding its breath. "Mrs. Vance?" she asked. Her voice was low, resonant, completely devoid of the warmth one expects at such an event. "Yes," I managed, my throat tight. "Can I help you?" She didn't offer a handshake or an expression of sympathy. Instead, she reached into a slim leather briefcase she carried and pulled out a single, laminated photograph. She didn't hand it to me. She held it firmly between 2 fingers, angled so only I could see the image. It was a wedding photo. A younger David, beaming, his arm around a woman who was definitely not me. The woman in the photo had striking red hair, not the deep auburn David and I used to joke about, but a vibrant, unmistakable crimson. My breath hitched. I recognized the suit David was wearing. It was the one he'd worn to his cousin's wedding 5 years before we even met. "My name is Clara Bellwether," the woman stated, her eyes, a pale, piercing gray, locked onto mine. "And I must apologize for the timing, but I have to inform you that you have just buried the wrong husband." The sound of the coffin chains rattling as the crew prepared to lower it seemed deafeningly loud. My sister gasped audibly behind me. I don't understand," I whispered, my mind scrambling for any logical explanation. A distant relative, a prank, an old colleague David had mentioned in passing. Clara Bellwether gave a slight, chilling smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's quite simple, Alara. David Vance and I were married in 2008. We divorced in 2014, shortly before he met you. A legal finalization that was messy, deeply inconvenient for both of us, and apparently entirely incomplete." She tapped the photograph. "This is David, my David, and I am his first wife." The reality of what she was saying started to sink in, heavy and cold, worse than the rain. David had told me everything about his past. There were no gaps, no veiled references to a previous marriage. He had presented our life together as the foundation of everything he'd ever truly built. "That's impossible," I choked out, shaking my head violently. "We filed all the paperwork. There were no outstanding legal ties. He would have told me." "Oh, he told you what you needed to hear," Clara corrected, leaning in conspiratorially, forcing me to step back slightly. David was never very good at tying up loose ends, especially when those ends were inconvenient, like a binding legal contract with a woman who knew about that little indiscretion he had with the company funds back in 2013. Indiscretion? David had been an exemplary employee. He had built his career from the ground up. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, suddenly galvanized by anger instead of shock. Clara's gaze flickered toward the retreating figures of the funeral attendees. "Let's take this conversation somewhere quieter, shall we? I have copies of the original marriage certificate, a prenuptial agreement that I suspect was never properly dissolved, and a pending litigation file regarding a sizable inheritance David never declared. I assume that inheritance is currently sitting in the trust you created last year, yes?" The blood drained from my face. The inheritance was the seed money for the house deposit, a sizable sum David claimed he'd saved diligently from his bonuses. If this woman was telling the truth, it wasn't his savings. It was hers, perhaps tied up in a decades-old legal agreement she was now wielding like a weapon. "You can't do this," I pleaded, feeling the tears finally threaten to spill. Not for David's death, but for the destruction of everything I believed in. Not here, not now. Clara straightened up, the rain finally beginning to thin, casting a weak, sickly yellow light on the scene. "I don't want to do this, Alara. But David left me no choice. He failed to disclose significant assets during our proceedings, and I've been tracking him for years, waiting for the right moment to bring this to light. His death, while tragic for you, is a legal complication for me. You see, under the terms of the Bellwether Trust, if David died while still technically married to me—" She paused, letting the implication hang in the cold air, her eyes alight with a strange, cold triumph. "If he died while married to me," she repeated, emphasizing the word married, "then all his assets revert to the surviving spouse. That means everything he left you, the house, the accounts, the business shares, legally belongs to me." I stared at her, the muddy ground seeming to shift beneath my feet. I had just buried a ghost, a man whose entire life story had been a carefully curated lie designed to protect him from a past he clearly never intended to face. And now, this stranger, this first wife, stood claiming ownership of my entire future, standing right next to the raw earth that was supposed to be my final goodbye. "You're lying," I managed, the words barely audible. Clara merely smiled again, a predator's smile, and then she pointed toward the official paperwork the funeral director was carefully folding up, the documents listing David's primary surviving next of kin. "Look closely at the paperwork they just filed with the county clerk, Ilara. Tell me if your name is listed as the widow," she challenged, "or if the legal record still shows a primary beneficiary named Clara Bellwether." My vision tunneled. The black car, Sarah's worried face, the polite, hushed condolences. It all dissolved into a distant, meaningless noise. All I could see was the sheaf of official papers the funeral director, Mr. Hemlock, was tucking into his leather portfolio. The man whose professionalism I had relied on moments ago, the keeper of final rights, now felt like an unwilling accessory to this unfolding catastrophe. "Mr. Hemlock!" I heard myself shout, the sound ragged and foreign. I surged forward, forgetting the mud, forgetting my grief, driven by a sudden, desperate need to see the cold, undeniable text for myself. Mr. Hemlock, a man whose default expression was one of mild clerical sorrow, blinked in surprise at my near-hysterical tone. He paused, looking from me to Clara, who stood back with an unnerving stillness, clearly enjoying my unraveling. "Mrs. Vance, is everything all right?" Hemlock asked, clutching the portfolio tighter. "The paperwork," I gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the sheaf. "The legal notification of death. I need to see the listed spouse designation, right now." Clara took a slow, deliberate step closer to Hemlock, her presence radiating authority that seemed to short-circuit the funeral director's polite compliance. "Mr. Hemlock, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Ilara is clearly overwhelmed." No, I shot back, planting myself between them. I am overwhelmed by her presence. David told me everything. He lied about nothing. Show me the papers. Hemlock looked utterly trapped. He glanced between the two women, one sobbing internally, the other radiating icy control, and made the pragmatic choice of avoiding a public scene. He sighed, peeling off the top sheet of carbon copies. Mrs. Vance, the state filings are standard. Next of kin is clearly listed as you, he said, quickly showing me the signature line near the bottom. My name, Alara Vance, was indeed printed clearly. Relief, momentary and sharp, flashed through me. I whirled on Clara. See? I am his wife, his widow. You are mistaken, or you are trying to extort us. Clara didn't even glance at the paper Hemlock offered. She just shook her head, pity lacing her tone, which somehow made her fury even more potent. You are looking at the preliminary notification of death filed by the attending physician, Alara. That names the person present at the time of passing, the person living in the household. Standard procedure for immediate closure. She then nodded toward Hemlock's portfolio. The actual filing, the one that dictates estate transfer, the one that needs to be recorded with the probate court by end of business today, is in there. The one that requires the identification of the legal spouse, which is determined by the final court order issued in 2014, or the lack thereof. Hemlock swallowed hard, his face paling beneath the fluorescent glow of the tent light. He knew. He knew this was messy, perhaps even criminal, and he desperately wanted to be rid of us both. Mrs. Bellwether has a point regarding the historical documentation, Hemlock admitted quietly, looking at the ground. When David retained counsel for the divorce proceedings 7 years ago, there were documents filed in Superior Court, a motion to dissolve marital assets. But I recall the case stalling. David's lawyer retired suddenly, and the final decree was never actually signed by the presiding judge. It was considered abandoned by David's subsequent counsel when he married you 2 years later, as they assumed the initial filing was simply a threat. He was married to me when he married me, I cried out, my voice cracking. You said you divorced in 2014. Clara stepped forward, placing a hand gently, possessively, on David's newly laid granite marker. We intended to divorce in 2014, Alara, but David never followed through. He let the case languish. Legally, in this jurisdiction, if the final decree is never entered and accepted by the court, the marriage is still active until dissolution by death or a final judgment. My knees buckled, and Sarah was instantly there, wrapping an arm around my waist to keep me upright. I stared at Clara, the cold rain starting up again, washing over the scene like a judgment. So, you're saying David was a bigamist? I whispered, the word tasting like ash. My entire marriage, built on honesty and trust, was a fraud resting on a procedural technicality. Bigamy is such a vulgar term, Clara tutted. I prefer to think of it as David maintaining 2 legally binding, albeit poorly documented, marriages simultaneously. And now one of them has conveniently expired. And guess which one was the original contract? She held up her phone, tapping the screen once. I've already notified David's partners at Vance and Sterling. They were receptive when I presented them with the original marriage certificate from our small ceremony in Montana. My mind raced back to the business meetings, the late nights, the shared dreams of building that firm. If Clara controlled David's interest in the partnership... The house deed, I forced out. We bought the house last year. It's in both our names. My name is on the title. Clara looked genuinely amused now. Is it? Or is it David Vance, unmarried man, transferring property to Alara Vance, his girlfriend at the time, to circumvent future legal entanglement with me? Check your closing documents, Alara. I'd wager the title reads David Vance, a single man, not David Vance and Alara Vance, husband and wife. I suddenly remembered the awkward conversation about the deed. David had insisted on keeping things simple, saying marriage certificates were just paperwork when they were starting their life together, preferring to rely on their commitment. He hadn't wanted to taint the process with his messy past, he'd said. He had lied about his marital status to the title company. If Clara was right, I was living in a house technically owned by a dead man whose estate now belonged to his other wife. "You're just doing this for the money," I spat, tears finally breaking free and mixing with the rain. Clara tilted her head, her gaze softening slightly, but not with sympathy, with strategy. "Of course I am. But think about it, Alara. I'm offering you a clean break. Take what you can salvage from the personal effects, the small annuities he might have set up outside the main trust, and walk away. If I fight this in probate, it will drag on for years. I'll bankrupt you proving this technicality. But if you cooperate, I can make this quick. I'll even let you keep the dog." Sarah squeezed my shoulder tightly. "Alara, we need to leave. We need a lawyer." "Yes," I agreed weakly, pulling away from Sarah, my eyes fixed on the headstone. "David, you magnificent, selfish liar." As we turned to walk toward the car, a movement near the newly dug plot caught my attention. A utility truck, not belonging to the cemetery staff, was pulling slowly up to the edge of the plot area. 2 men in unmarked dark uniforms climbed out. They weren't carrying shovels. They were carrying clipboards. Clara saw them too. Her perfect composure fractured for the first time. Her eyes widened fractionally, and she took an instinctive step back from the headstone, clutching her briefcase tight to her chest. "What is this?" she hissed, glancing wildly around. One of the men approached Mr. Hemlock, showing an official-looking badge and an internal review card. "We're looking for the next of kin regarding the estate of David Vance. We have a subpoena for immediate seizure of all related documentation pertaining to any undisclosed financial assets linked to a current or former marital contract." The second man walked straight toward Clara. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the vicinity of the deceased. We have reason to believe that Mr. Vance was involved in a very serious attempt to sabotage a major municipal infrastructure contract last year. We have a warrant for all personal effects relevant to that ongoing investigation." Clara's face went utterly white. She looked from the uniformed men to me and then back to the grave, realizing that David hadn't just left her with messy paperwork. He'd left her tied up in something far darker than fraud. "Wait, I don't know anything about that," Clara stammered, her voice cracking. "I only came about the marriage validation. I'm the first wife." The agent didn't flinch. He looked at me, then at Clara, his expression grim. "We're not interested in who's technically married to him right now, ma'am. We're interested in who stands to inherit his liabilities. And that might be both of you. Now come with us, please. We need to secure your briefcase." He reached out, not for my hand, but directly for the leather bag Clara was desperately holding. Clara clutched the briefcase to her chest as if it contained the last vestiges of her life raft. The 2 men in dark, unmarked jackets moved with an unnerving, practiced coordination, effectively boxing her in against the granite marker. "This is outrageous. I have rights. I am the legal spouse," Clara shrieked, the veneer of cold control completely shattering. The sound echoed thinly in the newly quiet, rain-soaked cemetery. The agent, whose badge identified him only as Agent Miller, remained maddeningly calm. "Ma'am, we are here concerning the ongoing inquiry into potential corporate espionage and the attempted sabotage of the Riverfront Dam project. We have reason to believe Mr. Vance was the source of classified data leaks, and anyone standing to inherit his active, unclosed financial structures might be compromised or complicit. We need to see everything in that bag immediately." My mind struggled to connect the dots. David, the meticulous architect who only ever fought with suppliers over the quality of marble tile, involved in sabotage? Riverfront Dam? That was the massive public works project he'd been overseeing for the last 18 months, the one that had nearly cost him his health due to the stress. "Attempted sabotage?" I echoed weakly, looking from the agents to Clara, who now looked terrified, the promise of inheriting a fortune suddenly replaced by the threat of a serious criminal investigation. Agent Miller glanced at me, acknowledging my existence only because I was standing near the grave. "Mrs. Vance, we'd prefer you remain clear of this area. This is now a matter of national security inquiry. We advise you to contact your counsel and do not leave the city." He turned his attention back to Clara. "The briefcase, Ms. Bellwether, now." Clara made a desperate, foolish move. She tried to shove past the agent toward the open cemetery gates, still clinging to the leather bag. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is a civil matter regarding property transfer. I haven't signed anything. I haven't moved any funds." The second agent moved instantly, intercepting her path with a solid, unmoving presence. Clara slammed into him, the impact jarring the briefcase loose. It tumbled onto the wet grass, the clasp springing open just as Agent Miller lunged for it. The contents spilled out onto the mud, not just papers, but a thin metallic device, a data drive, military grade in its heavy casing, and several thick manila envelopes. As Agent Miller snatched up the drive, Clara scrambled for the envelopes. But it was what fell out of the bottom of the briefcase that stopped my heart entirely. Tucked into a hidden, zippered compartment beneath a thick stack of Bellwether Trust documents was a small, antique velvet pouch. And spilling from that pouch, glistening dully even in the weak sunlight, were 3 heavy, tarnished gold coins. They were distinctive, bearing an unfamiliar, harsh-edged crest, nothing like modern currency. They looked ancient, ceremonial, and incredibly valuable. Clara saw them fall. She let out a sound of pure despair, scrambling to cover them. "No, not those. Those are mine. They have nothing to do with David." Agent Miller paused his examination of the data drive and looked down at the spilled coins, then back at Clara with a new, calculating intensity. "What are those, Ms. Bellwether? Artifacts? Smuggled goods? These look significant." Clara snatched the pouch up, her hands shaking so violently she could barely close the drawstring. "They are family heirlooms. They were never part of the divorce. They are personal property." "We'll be the judge of that," Agent Miller stated, signaling his partner. "Secure the individual and seize all contents of the container. We'll sort out what belongs to the estate and what belongs to the espionage inquiry later." The agents moved swiftly. Clara was gently but firmly escorted away, protesting violently, her accusations about my late husband now completely eclipsed by her own frantic denials about artifacts and espionage. They led her toward the unmarked van parked down the access road. I stood frozen, the rain now a light drizzle, watching the scene unfold, the image of David, my loving, honest David, now overlaid with whispers of corporate sabotage and mysterious gold coins. Sarah put a hand on my arm. "Alara, we have to go, now, before they decide you're the current spouse who inherits his liabilities." We practically ran to our car. As we sped away from the cemetery, leaving Clara's hysterics echoing behind us, I pulled out my phone, hands slick with nervous sweat. I bypassed my sister and called the only person I could think of who might understand the legal minefield David had apparently constructed. David's longtime personal attorney, Mr. Davies. Davies picked up on the first ring, sounding annoyed at the interruption. "Alara, I thought you were occupied with services. I'm sorry about David, truly, but I'm incredibly busy handling the immediate closure paperwork with his partners. They are eager to finalize the transfer of his shares to his surviving spouse." "Davies, stop," I cut him off, my voice tight with controlled panic. "Forget the shares. Did David ever mention Clara Bellwether? Did he ever mention an undissolved marriage from 2014? A long, terrible silence stretched across the line. I could hear Davies breathing, deep and labored. "Alara," he finally said, his voice stripped of its professional cheerfulness, sounding suddenly old and exhausted. "David swore to me, on everything he held sacred, that the Bellwether divorce was finalized. He gave me the closing documents. I filed them myself. I ran the search. There was no outstanding record." "Then why is she here claiming she's still married to him?" I screamed into the phone. "Because," Davies whispered, and the sound of his voice was worse than any shouting, "because that woman is ruthless. She found a loophole, a filing error from 7 years ago that David was too arrogant or too scared to correct. If she can prove that, everything he signed over to you in the last 5 years is voidable." "Voidable to me," I corrected, feeling a sickening lurch in my stomach as I remembered the gold coins. "But what about the government agents? They mentioned corporate espionage and sabotage. What did David really do?" Davies hesitated again, a shorter pause this time, as if steeling himself for the final blow. "Alara, when David married you, he took out a massive life insurance policy, naming you the sole beneficiary. A few months later, he adjusted the policy payout structure. He transferred the majority of the principal into a secondary irrevocable trust. He told me it was to protect the funds from Bellwether if she ever resurfaced. My heart hammered against my ribs. And who controls that trust now? That's the problem, Davies choked out. The document specifies the funds revert to the surviving spouse only if the death is ruled natural causes or accidental. If David's death is ruled connected to any form of willful illegal activity, including the espionage the agents mentioned, the entire principle of that trust is immediately forfeited to the investigating government agency involved. And worse, he took a deep, ragged breath, and I knew what was coming. Worse, Elara, the beneficiary clause for the secondary payouts, the smaller annuities he set aside for immediate liquidation upon passing, reverts not to you, but to the first legal spouse on record, in the event the primary beneficiary is disqualified by criminal investigation. I looked down at my hands, now gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. David hadn't just left me heartbroken and potentially broke. He had left me exposed. So, if the state seizes the main inheritance because of his alleged crimes, I said slowly, my voice flat, Clara gets the rest of his liquid cash? Yes, Davies confirmed grimly. And Elara, I just got a call from the partners. They weren't just eager to settle his shares. They're terrified. They said they need to meet with you and Clara Bellwether together immediately because they found something else in David's private office that he was keeping separate from the firm's records. Something that suggests he didn't just try to sabotage the dam. They found blueprints, Elara. Blueprints for a secondary, highly illegal diversion system, and they were clearly annotated with both your name and Clara's name. The secondary diversion system blueprints. The thought hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. David and I had argued about the stress of the riverfront dam, but he'd always framed it as professional pressure, the usual fight between engineering vision and budget constraints. He'd never mentioned building an illegal secondary system. And Clara's name? Why would his supposed secret ex-wife, a woman he claimed to despise, be co-signing clandestine engineering schematics? My name? I managed to ask Davies, my voice barely a rasp. Why would David include my name on plans for illegal construction? I don't know, Elara. That's what the partners are demanding we resolve before the agents come back for round 2. They are convinced this isn't just about David anymore. They think there was a network, a conspiracy, and that the two of you, the current wife and the first wife, were the intended fall guys, or perhaps the silent partners. I slammed the phone down, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the car. Sarah looked at me, her face etched with fear. What did he say? What about the blueprints? It's worse than a messy divorce, Sarah. David wasn't just lying about being single. He was potentially committing massive corporate fraud, maybe worse, and he involved both of us, me, his current wife, and Clara, his undivorced wife, in the paperwork. He set a trap. We drove in stunned silence toward my lawyer's downtown office, the glass and steel towers of the financial district suddenly looking like the bars of a cage. When we arrived, the scene was already tense. 2 partners from Vance and Sterling, Mark and Thomas, were pacing the waiting area, looking pale and frantic. And sitting calmly on a leather sofa, already seemingly under the protection of a fast-acting, high-powered legal team, was Clara Bellwether. She hadn't been arrested. She'd been expedited. Elara, thank heavens, Mark Vance, David's senior partner, rushed toward me, ignoring Clara completely. We need to talk. Now. Davies, you brought the necessary documentation? Davies nodded grimly, ushering us all into the mahogany-paneled conference room. Clara didn't look up, speaking only to her own shark-like lawyer. My client is prepared to discuss the asset transfer immediately, Clara's lawyer stated. But we also require assurance that she will not be implicated in the ongoing federal investigation concerning Mr. Vance's criminal activities, of which she was clearly unaware. Thomas, the other partner, slammed his hand on the table. Unaware? Clara, your name is on the structural override schematics for the dam. They detail a secondary release valve that bypasses all safety protocols. The diversion would have flooded the entire lower valley during heavy runoff. Millions of lives at risk. Billions in damages. And David explicitly marked that section of the annotation sheet. CB, final sign-off required. Clara finally looked up, her face a mask of theatrical shock. That's a forgery! I have never seen those plans. I told you, I only came here for my marital rights. You came here to secure the assets before the Fed seized them, I shot back, finally finding my voice. You were terrified when those agents mentioned the gold coins, Clara. What were those? Payment for your sign-off? The atmosphere became so toxic you could practically taste the antagonism. The two partners looked at me with undisguised suspicion. Alara, Mark said carefully, his eyes darting between me and Clara, we are trying to salvage the firm. If the government finds these plans, they won't just blame David. They will look at everyone who stood to profit from the dam's completion, or its calculated failure. You and David lived together. You managed the household accounts. We need to know if you saw anything suspicious, any large influx of cash, any meetings with unknown individuals. I saw him stressed, working himself into an early grave, I retorted, my voice rising. I saw him hiding a previous marriage. That's all I saw. It was Clara's lawyer who broke the deadlock, sliding a sheaf of papers across the table toward me. Before we discuss any partnership liabilities, Ms. Vance, let's resolve the immediate legal issue. Here is the finalized settlement offer from my client, predicated on her being recognized as the sole surviving legal spouse. I picked up the document. It was cold, clinical, and horrifying. Clara was demanding full ownership of the house, all liquid savings, and a controlling interest in David's stock portfolio, a total settlement valued at nearly $10 million. This is extortion, I breathed, throwing the papers back onto the table. It's the law, her lawyer countered smoothly. Unless you can produce a signed divorce decree from 2014 proving David was free to marry you. And unless she can explain why her name is on a federal crime scene blueprint, Sarah interjected fiercely, stepping up beside me. Just then, the door to the conference room burst open, not politely, but forcefully. It was Agent Miller, flanked by two more grim-faced officers. They bypassed the lawyers and walked straight toward the center of the table, looking directly at Clara and me. We've completed our initial sweep of the premises, Agent Miller announced, his voice resonating with authority. We have secured Ms. Bellwether's data drive. It contained extensive encrypted communication logs and several large wire transfer receipts, all originating from an offshore account. The account was established in 2015. Miller looked pointedly at Clara. The transfers stopped abruptly in early 2017. The reason, Ms. Bellwether, is that the account was emptied. We are tracing the recipient now, but the trail is highly sophisticated. Clara's eyes darted to me, a quick, desperate plea mixed with raw accusation. Then Miller looked at me, his gaze piercing. Mrs. Vance, we have a problem. The encryption keys we recovered from Mrs. Bellwether's drive are complex, requiring a secondary verification key, a password unique to the sender and recipient. He paused, leaning over the table. We managed to brute force the first part of the key structure. It seems to be based on a personal anniversary date. We believe the date corresponds to the date David Vance officially married the recipient of those funds. My mind flashed back to the only anniversary David ever celebrated publicly, our wedding date, the one that, according to Clara, was illegal. We're running the search now, Miller continued, pulling out a smaller tablet. If the key matches your wedding date, Alara, it proves you were the recipient of those offshore funds starting in 2015, making you complicit in the money laundering aspect of the dam scheme. If it matches Ms. Bellwether's supposed 2008 marriage date, then she was the recipient, and David was funding her silence. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the tablet. Mark and Thomas watched with morbid fascination, ready to write off whoever the key implicated. Clara held her breath, her entire future hanging on the digital output. Agent Miller looked up, his face impassive. We have a match. The key corresponds precisely to the original marriage date filed in Montana in 2008. Clara let out a gasp of vindication, her lawyer already reaching for the document of settlement. See? I told you, I am the surviving spouse with financial ties. But Agent Miller wasn't finished. He looked directly at me, his eyes holding a depth of grim certainty that chilled me to the core. However, he stated, tapping the tablet one final time, the transaction history shows the final wire transfer, the largest one, was sent the day before David Vance was admitted to the hospital for his final diagnosis. And it wasn't sent to Clara Bellwether's known accounts. It was sent to a completely new, untraceable digital wallet. He looked down at the tablet, frowning slightly. The receiving address, he murmured, loud enough for us all to hear, is registered to a pseudonym, but the security passphrase attached to that final transfer, it wasn't based on a date at all. It was a name, a single word. He raised his eyes slowly, locking them onto mine. The final transfer was addressed to the wallet named Elara_the_widow. And the transfer receipt is timestamped precisely 3 hours after David Vance signed a new codicil to his will, naming you as the executor of his entire estate, conditional upon his death being ruled of natural causes. The air in the conference room solidified, the weight of the final revelation crushing everything else, the spurious marriage claims, the corporate espionage, the ancient gold coins. Elara the widow. David hadn't just been playing a game with his past. He'd been running a desperate, meticulously timed escape plan right up to his final conscious breath. My mind raced, reconstructing the last desperate days. The overwhelming exhaustion, the morphine, the moments he drifted in and out of lucidity. He hadn't been dreaming. He'd been working. I looked at Davies, the lawyer who had sworn David was clean, and saw the dawning horror in his eyes. "The codicil," I managed. "You knew about a codicil?" Davies shook his head violently. "No, I swore on my license he signed nothing after entering hospice care. He told me he wanted Clara to have the minor assets to keep her quiet, and everything else, the firm, the house, the main trusts, to go to you, provided we could fight Bellwether on the technicality." Agent Miller leaned forward, his voice dropping, suddenly less official and more predatory. "Then someone lied to you, Mr. Davies, because this transfer, this final massive payout, it moved out of David Vance's control after the hospital confirmed his prognosis, bypassing the automatic freeze protocols meant to protect the estate from pending criminal investigation." He turned his focus entirely to me, the suspicion heavy in the room. "Mrs. Vance, you told us you were unaware of any large financial maneuvers. Yet David set aside a massive sum, labeled specifically for Elara Sumber the widow, we're courting to continue to live or lust in David Can. Elara the widow month step for each on the way. He told us they made themselves building like, and he just from of the when they left to manager. Elara the widow mutts together brief from the state, because of this ways to be fleshing to the life and everything that David Vance come in the month. He said me, let's figure out my David Vances, again my creative new months of them, and support it in the way. Mrs. Vance, you told us you were unaware of any large financials protect the estate by pending to building the months below that detect the house for David Vance. David Vance, you call them to make the time and much more treatment. Much more to make the time and even lighter last. New months to deliver comfortable message to estate form them. But this moved out of David Vance, you need to be wearing at many large financials maneuvers. The specifically produced body, you actually deliver more any large financials. You may be lift in new months to the paking for David Vance, you may be great months, but if you mean that David Vance come in today, and even seen that David Vance to perfect, you need the massive sum of great months and detention to estate form the maneuver. Mrs. Vance, you told us you were unaware of any large financials, because they've advanced in the month that specifically love. He said no. Mrs. Vance, you told us you were unaware of any large financials, but if you mean that David Vance for me, you may be lift in a month for them to make the right. Mrs. Vance, you told us you were unaware of any large financials. You may be lift in the month for them to make the right. There begin to the specific leads. Let's know any dead. You may be left. Mr. Vance never come from. Develop needed and delivering rating and Agent Miller fleshing. Less final financial maneuvers. Because this transfer, this final the widow, and you are the only one here to be left, are the only one here who stands to gain if his death is deemed natural. Clara, seeing her entire claim dissolve into the face of a potential federal theft charge, suddenly found her courage. She snatched the papers back from the table, fueled by spite. She was in on it. She was the front, the offshore account. She must have used her marriage date as the password because she knew it was the date that invalidated my divorce. She was planning to frame me for the espionage while she walked away with the real payoff. Sarah stepped forward, her loyalty unwavering. That's absurd. Ilara was nursing him. She was holding his hand, not hacking international accounts. She had motive and access to the password sequence, Clara screamed. She was the one he married after the initial legal entanglement. The partners, Mark and Thomas, looked at me with sudden, terrifying clarity. If I was complicit in moving millions right before his death, they would join the investigation immediately, hoping to implicate me and secure the firm's assets for themselves. I took a deep breath, the realization of David's calculated final move settling over me. He hadn't just protected me from Clara, he had prepared a final, definitive defense against the government and against his own partners. "Agent Miller," I said, my voice startlingly clear, "if David set up that final transfer to my wallet, he did it for a reason. He knew the damn investigation was coming. He knew Clara was waiting in the wings. He knew you would freeze everything." I walked over to the chair where Clara had been sitting and picked up the small, antique velvet pouch she had dropped earlier. The heavy, tarnished gold coins spilled into my palm. I held them out to Agent Miller. "These are what Clara was truly terrified of losing. They're not related to the dam. They are ancient artifacts, likely stolen decades ago. David was a history buff, not a grave robber, but he had a penchant for acquiring things his former wife hoarded." I turned to Clara, who watched me with wide, horrified eyes. "You came here to bury David and claim his estate based on a loophole, Clara. But David anticipated that. He knew you wouldn't just walk away clean. He knew you were waiting to exploit his death." I looked back at Miller. "The offshore account funding stopped in 2017. Not because David paid you off, but because he found out what you were doing. The money wasn't for your silence. It was severance, which you likely spent, and then you began hoarding leverage, the gold, the knowledge of the undissolved marriage, to use against him now." I met the agent's gaze, the raw grief replaced by a fierce, protective clarity. David knew the investigation would freeze the estate, but the money in the wallet labeled Ilara the Widow, that was a different. I loved to understand what was information for the gold. It made new summons to be clearly using David and major agency, the money in the university days. David knew the Davidiv transfer whether a new name, but that's going to be an accepting is pretty provided. The money in the wallet labeled Ilara the Widow, that was being inflorided. I met the agent's gaze capum with a rimmed of dam said, David knew the investigation would freeze the estate. That was common surround there. They beat them to freeze the day is making. I met the agent's gaze destruct the road of the world with a grade of what started into my. He knew the David takes from David, but the money in the wallet label, they were doing another day of me. I flow the David employs the first flower way, they didn't seem to fierce protective clarity. That wasn't part of the estate. That was a personal gift, transferred outside the legal system, precisely so I could use it to hire the best defense, to clear my name, and to fight Clara's claim, should she ever resurface. I held up the pouch of coins. These coins? They are leverage against Clara. David didn't just leave me a divorce battle. He left me the evidence to put his first wife away for illegal artifact possession and potential conspiracy related to corporate espionage, the information he likely kept secret from me until he knew he was dying. The partners stared, stunned by the pivot. David hadn't been the perpetrator in this final act. He had been the architect of his own defense, using his final moments to safeguard his true legacy with me. Agent Miller took the gold coins, his expression shifting from suspicion to grudging respect. He nodded once to me. "Mrs. Vance, the data on the drive implicates Ms. Bellwether in several matters we are now prioritizing. If you can provide testimony regarding these artifacts, and if the transfer to your wallet can be legally proven as a personal transfer prior to the formal investigation freeze, we can process your status as a cooperating witness." Clara started to protest again, but Agent Miller's partner stepped forward. "Ms. Bellwether, you are being detained for questioning regarding potential conspiracy and trafficking of cultural artifacts. You have the right to remain silent." As Clara was escorted out, her final furious glare cementing my new reality, I looked at Davies, who sagged in his chair, wiping sweat from his brow. "She was right about one thing, Ilara. David did lie about the divorce, but he lied to protect you from her, not to deceive you. The house, the firm, the life, it was all going to be a battle now, involving federal agents and lawyers. But I had the funds, the justification, and most importantly, the truth. David had died protecting me, not from cancer, but from the web of lies he'd built years ago. I turned to Sarah, a ghost of a smile touching my lips, the rain finally stopping outside, letting weak sunlight stream into the room. "Well, Sarah," I said, placing my hand on the spot where the settlement papers lay, now irrelevant, "it looks like I'm not just Alara Vance, the grieving widow. I'm Alara Vance, the inheritor, the witness, and apparently the only person who ever truly understood what David was building."